Now we're going to talk about landscape photography. After photographing people or doing portraits, landscape photography is probably the thing that most photographers like to do the most. And it's obvious why. We go places, we see interesting things, we experience these places, and we want to make photographs of the landscape, though it could be a natural landscape or an urban landscape, it doesn't really matter, but some kind of place rather than people that we want to share with the people who are going to be the viewers of our photographs. And so when I'm doing landscapes, I have a series of kind of questions that I'm asking myself. And not all questions apply to every single photograph, but if you look on your screen, there's a series of questions that I'm typically going to be looking at. I'm going to look at the place that I'm photographing and think, is there some lines that I might use? Is there some kind of movement in the scene that may be worth capturing? If I stay there long enough, is the weather going to change in some interesting way? I want to pay attention to the time of day. Is this the correct time of day to photograph this place, or maybe I should be coming back at a different time? I spend a lot of time looking at horizon lines because that line of the horizon, typically below the horizon line, is the landscape. Above the horizon line, of course, is the sky. And I want to make sure that I use both of those elements in ways that add to the narrative. I want to try to control my depth of field. Oftentimes in the case of a landscape, you're going to maximize your depth of field so everything is in focus, as compared to a portrait, which most of the times you're only going to have one thing in focus. Not always, but most of the time. A lot of people who do landscape work will use a tripod. Sometimes I use a tripod, sometimes I don't. But if you're going to have a lot of depth of field and therefore use a slow shutter speed, you're going to run into camera shake issues, and so that's when I definitely would pull out the tripod. Or find some place like a rock or a table to rest on. I'm always going to look for a focal point, which is the point, of course, that's in focus. And the point that's in focus in any photograph is typically where the viewer starts, because when something is in focus, that's the sharpest thing, obviously, and that's the thing they'll go to first. And so I want to think about how the focal point will add to the narrative, bring the viewer in, and make them look at the part of the image or the part of story in the way that I want. One of my next steps is I'm going to be examining the foreground. Because again, our eyes typically enter images from the bottom, and so I want to make sure the foreground is adding to the narrative. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to consider the sky. And by that I mean, do I want to have a lot of sky? Do I want to have a little sky? Probably the most common mistake that people make when they're photographing landscapes is that our eyes do a remarkably good job of taking that bright sky and that much darker piece of land and merging them one into one, so we think that our camera will record both of them. And of course you take a picture of a piece of land and a piece of sky, and in fact one is much brighter than the other, and the digital technology, or even the old film technology by the way, cannot handle that difference in brightness. And so you need to actually, especially if you want to master landscape photography, you want to understand the difference between what your eye sees and what your brain processes and how those are put together by your brain and your eye, versus the very limited ability of the digital cameras, and the film cameras too, to capture the extremes in brightness from a bright sky to a darkly lit piece of landscape. So now we're going to look at some landscape images. The first one's by Frank Siteman. And he has a lot of the elements that I was talking about before. He's got some nice lines of the asphalt. The sun is low on the horizon to the right, so it's a good use of the time of day. The grass being rich, green, adds to the narrative of the story of the photograph as well. Another photograph of Frank's from the autumn, where you have the magical colors of those red leaves and the orange leaves against the green leaves, and that pattern of different trees and different leaves is what makes the image so interesting. This particular photograph is by George Schaub, the Digital Photo Academy editorial director. And he's using many of the elements that we've been talking about before. His horizon line is not in the middle. In fact, his horizon line is about 1/3 of the image is from the horizon line down, and 2/3 of the image is sky. And so he's used that rule of thirds. And in the foreground, he has a couple of rocks, which are the starting points or the focal points that bring our eye into the image to work our way through. Another image by George Schaub from Yosemite. And he's using a lot of different elements here. The bright rock on the right side being the primary starting point, but then the darker trees to the left side, which are silhouetted, play off the darker trees on the left side, very nicely play off the bright rock on the right side. And so he's got a nice kind of balance going on, which is pretty typical for landscape photographs. You want to be paying attention to the kind of balance between the right and the left, or the top and the bottom. Another one by George Schaub, and Similar kind of thing. The vast majority of this image, you'll notice, is mostly sky, because the most interesting part of what he saw was those clouds rather than the mountaintops. So in this case, I would say 20% of the image is land and 80% is sky. And I mention those numbers because there's no hard and fast formula. You can't say 50-50. There are some pictures that work 50-50, some work 70-30. This one looks like it's 80-20 or maybe even 85% sky and maybe 15% land. Another one of George's, he's using the trees in the foreground to play off the clouds in the background. Plus, of course, it's a great use of the time of day. And also the colors of that orange sky, which I'm guessing is in the afternoon, really adds to the drama of the image. And then, of course, a rainbow. All the elements come together where you've got the interesting repetition of the three trees in the foreground. Maybe 20% of the image is the green grass, and the other 80% of the image, give or take, is the sky with the rainbow really punctuating it from the lower left to the upper right. And this is something that I do constantly when I'm photographing landscapes, and I encourage all photographers, is this idea of working the situation. So Frank found himself a really interesting tree with really beautiful fall colors, sort of orange-yellow leaves, and a mailbox in the foreground, and he photographed the same thing horizontally and vertically. And they really make very different pictures. The one on the right is more about the blue sky and the orange trees, and the one on the left is more about the landscape and the mailboxes. And one is not better than the other, just depends on the story you're trying to create. But for me, I'm going to go out there and make both images and probably a lot of variations in between, so when I come back I know I have at least one image which is just the way that I want. Another one of Frank's images, again using that idea of the really dramatic difference in the colors of the green tree and the green grass versus the painted red roof and the white walls of the church building to make a nice contrast between the two different subject matter. Beautiful clouds, also made by Frank Siteman from Boston, Digital Photo Academy instructor. And the really interesting to me is the pink, orange color on those clouds versus the deep blue of the sky beyond the clouds. And then the other thing that really helps with this, and this is that thing I mentioned before when you're doing landscape photos about the focal point or the entry point, is the palm tree to the left is really important because that's the starting point for when you view the photograph. Typically people come into images from the bottom. They'll go to the first thing, in this case it's the palm tree on the left, and then they'll slowly work their way through the open space on the right, going cloud to cloud to cloud. And all of those elements add up to a really nice landscape photograph. And so Frank has a combination here of leading lines with the sand and the footprints in the foreground drawing us into the image. And he's also used a lot of depth of field because you'll notice that the footprints in the foreground and the clouds in the far distance are all equally sharp, so he must have used a small aperture with a lot of depth of field, which in the case of a landscape photograph like this works well to carry us from the foreground to the background when everything is sharp. Next up will be a slideshow of these landscape photographs and some other bonus landscape photographs that I hope you'll look at. Pull out your notebook, take some notes, think about all the variables that I talked about before. The photographer's position from above or below, where was the light source, what was the time of day, what did they focus on? Did they have a lot of depth of field or did they have a little depth of field? And if you can look at a photograph and you can actually break those elements down, you'll eventually be able to take that skill of looking at other people's photographs and apply it to making your own photographs. And then after you've got good at that, you've looked at a lot of these photographs, you've made a lot of notes, you want to pause the lesson, you want to get your camera, you want to go out in the landscape, you want to enjoy the experience of being out there, of course, but you want to make some landscape photographs and try to apply as many of the different techniques as you saw here. Again, don't worry about making masterpieces. Just practice all the lessons, try to make different landscape photographs, and have fun. One of the most common problems that people have when they're photographing landscapes is the difference between that bright sky and the darker foreground. And one of the challenges is that our eyes and our brains process those two things, which are actually vastly different in brightness, the bright sky and the dark ground, and they kind of make them equal. So we look at them and we say, oh, they'll both come out fine in the photo. And in fact, the technology in all the cameras, film cameras from the bad old days, digital cameras now, neither of them can handle the vast difference between a bright sky and a darker foreground. What can handle that difference between the bright sky and the dark foreground is something like a Tiffen half neutral density filter. And the top half of the frame is 1 or 2 f-stops darker, so it'll darken that sky, and the bottom part of that filter is clear and it lets in all the light. And so basically what it does is gives me the ability to make half the scene, typically that bright sky, but not always, darker, so that bright sky and the darker foreground end up coming out with the same exposure on my sensor, and therefore I get a correctly exposed picture. So let me put it in an application. I'll show you how I'm going to use a Tiffen half neutral density filter to solve the problem of a very bright sky and a very dark foreground. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in my little bag of Tiffen filters, pull out the one that's going to work in this case, which is the Tiffen, and it actually says it right there, reminder, Tiffen Clear ND. And so if you look at it, on my hand, you should see the top half of it is darker than the bottom half. And that's really going to enable me to make more interesting landscape photographs where the sky is typically brighter than the bottom part of the scene. And the really nice thing about this is that it rotates, because not all the time is your line going to be a straight horizontal. Sometimes it's going to be vertical, half and half. So I can thread this into my camera, which is what I'm about to do right here. Thread this into my camera. Thread this into my camera right there. Just like that. Just like that right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through it and organize my picture and then slowly rotate this till I get that line in exactly the position that I want. So right now I'm actually about to rotate the filter. At the moment you'll notice the sky is very bright and the foreground is very dark. And as I rotate it, there we go. We're starting to get the effect that we want. The sky is much darker and the foreground is much lighter. And just to emphasize the point, I'm going to go a little too far and you'll notice, oops, now the sky is getting bright and the foreground is too dark. So that spot right about there is going to give me both a correctly exposed foreground and a correctly exposed background. So here I am in Boscobel in Cold Spring, New York, right on the Hudson River, and it is a beautiful summer day, I have to say. And I have the river unfolding me in front of me in the foreground, and I got this great sky with all these wonderful clouds, but the sky is a lot brighter than the foreground. And again, one of the big problems we have as photographers is that our eyes will do a remarkably good job of taking that darker foreground and that brighter sky above it and put the two together, and our eye will say they're okay. Our friend here, the camera, digital camera, film camera, doesn't make any difference. It can't handle that difference in brightness. So I'm actually going to use 2 different filters for this particular shot. The first one is the Clear ND or half ND filter, where half the frame is neutral density gray. So all that's going to do is reduce the exposure for half the scene, in this case the brighter sky. And then, and I'm not sure which order yet because I have to do some experiments, I'm also going to use a polarizer. And what a polarizer does, and this is a really typical example of when you do want to use a polarizer, is the clouds that are relatively close to me are really beautiful and crisp and the sky behind them is blue, but the ones that are way, way in the distance are starting to be kind of muddled and gray because of the haze. And haze is technically nothing but microscopic particles of water and other things in the air that the sun is reflecting off of. And so that point in time, to get rid of that hazing, you need a polarizing filter. Because what a polarizing filter does is it reduces the glare or the reflection off of any surface. And so in this case, that haze in the distance is technically a lot of little particles with reflections coming off of them. And so, and I can even see it as I turn the filter, there's a point right right there. So let's put them together on the cameras and see if it's going to give me the result I want. See if I can remember that now. So first I thread my polarizer in. So here I am turning the polarizer. You notice the sky is getting very hazy. And now the sky is nice and rich. The sky is hazy again. So yeah, the point where I want it is right about there. All right, there's one. And then I'm going to thread my clear ND filter on top, making sure not to change the position of my polarizer. So threading my clear ND in, which is taken. Okay, so now that's about there. And you can see at the moment I have my clear ND in the wrong position because the left side of the frame is actually too bright. Now the top of the frame is too bright and the bottom is too dark. And I'm slowly rotating my clear ND filter around as I go round, around, and round, around, around, right to there. That's, see if you'll notice the sky is too bright and the foreground is too dark. Now I'm getting the gray on the left side, the gray is coming over, the gray is coming over, the gray hits that cloud. And now, just like I want, the foreground and the background and the sky and the earth both have the same exposure. So this is when I'm actually going to start taking the pictures. I'm at Bosco Bell, a beautiful park on the Hudson River in Cold Spring, New York. And I'm out here to do some landscape photographs and teach you some lessons that you want to apply when you're out there thinking about and making landscape photographs. So the first thing that caught my eye when I arrived at Bosco Bell was this great set of trees here and the really, really nice framing that this set of trees creates. So I've got framing in the foreground and the beautiful landscape scene in the background. So I'm going to move around a little bit, try to put together a picture where you can see both the framing of the trees and the scene out there. So at this point in time, the only question I have is how much of that framing am I going to include and how much of that waterfall am I going to include. So probably at this point in time, I need to step back a little bit. So now I've got some really nice framing and then I'm just going to move around a little bit because at this point in time, that tree was blocking that nice fountain. But if I get over here, the fountain is completely visible, and so that's a much better composition. So a situation like this, where you have this beautiful framing, the dark part all around your scene, and a bright part in the background, that's the kind of situation that's going to throw your meter off. If you were to use a regular evaluative or matrix metering on most of your cameras, it's not going to be able to quite figure out what to do with the difference between that black at the top and the bottom for the framing and the center part that's in much brighter light. So a couple of ways you can come at this. One would be to zoom your lens in so you see nothing but the scene that's outside in the bright light. Or the other option is to actually set your metering pattern to spot meter, and again, only read the part that's out there in the brightly lit scene. Because the key here to making this image so interesting is getting a correct exposure for the part that's out in the bright light and letting the dark parts around here drop to black.